a city of gold, swallowed by smoke. To the Ashanti, it became the Sagrenti War, a name forged from the man who led the invasion. This war ends with fire in Kumasi in the first week of February 1874. It begins with a road, a season, and a commander who knew that in West Africa, time and distance can kill an army faster than bullets. His name was Sir Garnet Wolseley. He was not a lucky amateur. He was a professional who had already paid for his lessons in other places. In the early 19th century, the Ashanti Empire dominated the interior of what is today Ghana, a kingdom bound by allegiance to the Asantewaa and to sacred institutions, most famously the Golden Stool. Ashanti authority radiated from Kumasi through tributary and allied states, reaching down toward the coastal peoples, the Fante, the Ga, the Akwapem, whose polities straddled the strip between forest and sea. Along the coastline, European trading powers, British, Dutch, Danish, operated stone forts that had once been part of the Atlantic slave trade and had, over time, shifted toward gold, palm oil, and other commodities. Between the forest power and the sea power lay a band of small states that acted at once as buffers, brokers, and battlegrounds. The First Anglo-Ashanti War erupted in 1824. Its proximate cause was not a single incident, but an accumulation of pressures. The British sought to secure trade and protect coastal allies who chafed at Ashanti demands. The Ashanti, confident from victories inland and determined to preserve their privileges and influence down to the sea, pushed back. Into that storm walked Sir Charles McCarthy, the British governor of the Gold Coast, who marched inland with a small force to confront an Ashanti army near a place called Nsamankau. The result was a disaster for the British. McCarthy was killed in the fighting, and Ashanti warriors captured his head. The shock of that defeat burned a lesson into British memory. The forest could swallow a column, and Ashanti numbers, discipline, and knowledge of the bush could translate into devastating tactical advantage. The war did not end there. In 1826, at Dodowa, also known as Akatamanso, a different pattern emerged. Coastal peoples long threatened by Ashanti pressure rallied with British support, meeting an Ashanti army in a set-piece battle closer to the shore. There, concentrated firepower and a coalition's combined strength halted Ashanti forward motion. The fighting bled into diplomacy, and the period that followed did not resolve the underlying contest so much as suspend it. Both sides drew conclusions. From Nsamankau, the British learned not to underestimate Ashanti armies or the terrain. From Dodowa, they learned the value of coastal allies. The Ashanti learned too, weighing the limits of a push to the littoral in the face of a united coast supported by European guns. 4 decades later, the Second War began. In 1863, tensions over frontiers, fugitives, and trade erupted again. The British advanced inland, cautious but determined. Ashanti forces maneuvered to block them. Nature, more than either commander, decided the course. The rains came. The tracks dissolved into sludge. Malaria spread through the ranks. There were engagements and skirmishes, but no decisive battle. When the British fell back, they carried out not a trophy, but a failure. The campaign had been beaten by time and climate. If the first war had warned against contempt, the second warned against the calendar. An army that tried to force its way into the forest in the wrong season would pay for every step with lives. Those early wars set the template for the third. They also left a tangle of unfinished business. The interior and the coast were tied by trade and rivalry. People along the boundary owed layered obligations, some to Kumasi, some to their own chiefs, and some to the Europeans whose forts offered both goods and shelter. The British position grew more assertive as the 19th century wore on. Abolition and new commercial priorities shifted the moral language of empire, even as imperial competition continued in familiar forms. Forts changed hands. One spark was the handover of Dutch forts, including Elmina, to the British in 1872. Elmina had been a friendly doorway to the sea for the Ashanti. Now the British held it, along with old rivalries between Ashanti and coastal states like the Fante. That change lit the fuse. That transfer looked very different depending on where you stood. For British officials, it meant a cleaner line of authority and reduced friction with a wavering partner. For Dutch traders, It was a retreat in the face of British ascendancy. For the Fante, whose long rivalry with Ashanti power defined politics along the forest edge, British control of Elmina promised protection. For the Ashanti, Elmina had historically been a friendly gateway to the Atlantic world, a point where diplomacy and commerce could be conducted without British interference. Its loss signaled encirclement. The map, at a glance, told a story. The British now commanded most of the coast, tightening a band around Ashanti influence. This led to increased friction between the coastal states and the Ashantis. The Fante and other coastal allies encouraged British firmness, while the Ashanti expected deference from those they considered subjects or tributaries. Minor incidents, raids, arrests, refusals to acknowledge traditional obligations, flared and smoldered. By 1873, the frontier was hot with skirmishes and accusations. The British government, still sensitive to the disasters and disgraces of small wars that dragged on without resolution, opted for clarity. If there were to be an expedition, it would not be a slow-bleeding frontal creep into the bush. It would be planned, seasonal, and decisive. For this reason, one of Britain's most elite and decorated generals was withdrawn from his mission in Canada to lead this expedition. This was no other than General Sir Garnet Wolseley. Wolseley had fought in the Crimea, where he served with the engineers at Sevastopol and was wounded twice, losing sight in one eye. He served through the Indian Mutiny and later helped run the logistics that brought men and supplies home. In 1870, he led the Red River expedition across Canada, moving boats and men through lakes, rivers, and portages to end a rebellion with speed and order. That work made his name as a careful planner who could get a force into hard country and bring it out again intact. When trouble on the Gold Coast turned into a true war in 1873, London wanted an expedition that would finish fast and avoid the deadly rainy months. They picked Wolseley. He was appointed to govern Britain's West African settlements and to command the expedition. One man to plan, supply, and fight. The job fit his record: short, sharp campaigns, tight logistics, and clear endings. He also brought his own team. By 1873, people in the army were already talking about the Wolseley's Ring, able officers he had handpicked on earlier work in Canada and trusted to make things happen. Names like Redvers Buller, William Butler, Henry Brackenbury, Evelyn Wood, and George Colley appear again and again beside his. They were scouts, organizers, staffers, and field leaders who shared one habit: get the details right so the plan does not die on the road. Wolseley used them the way a builder uses a toolkit. His strategy for Ashanti was simple because it had to be. Step 1. Do not fight the climate. Move only in the dry season. In a letter to his wife in December 1873, he complained he was always condemned to command in expeditions which must be accomplished before a certain season of the year begins. He meant malaria and dysentery. He also meant rivers in flood, bridges washed out, and mud that turns men into casualties. So the clock itself was part of his plan. Get in, hit hard, get out before the unhealthy months. Step 2. Turn jungle into corridor. Engineers would cut and plank a track from Cape Coast to the Para River, what officers called the Ashanti Road. Where the path met streams or swamps, they would throw bridges and causeways. A later study counted hundreds of bridges, proof that the army was really building as it marched. The road was not only for feet, it was for the lifeline behind the feet. Food, ammunition, rockets, medical stores, and the little screw guns that could be carried in pieces and bolted together in the bush. Step 3. Use the rivers like extra roads. The surf here could kill a boat in a heartbeat, but once you were through the breakers, the brown waterways let you slip inland. Lieutenant Commander John Hext of the gunboat Decoy piloted a mixed flotilla across the surf and up the rivers. Paddlebox boats with 20-pounder guns on swivels, cutters and pinnaces fitted to fire rockets, a cutter with a 7-pounder, whaleboats for messages, even a spare jolly boat. Those boats carried men, guns, and news where feet could not go fast enough. The spark for this war came in 1872 when the Dutch handed their forts to the British, most of all Elmina, a long and friendly door to the sea for the Ashanti. Early in 1873, an Ashanti army, about 12,000 men, crossed the Pra and drove south through Fanti country toward the coast. The Royal Navy answered with guns at Elmina in June and July, while Wolseley shaped his inland push for the dry months. Reinforcements from London shifted course. HMS Amethyst headed for West Africa. On the 1st of December 1873, Royal Marines filed aboard HMS Dromedary bound for the Gold Coast. The expedition's two hands, the sea and the road, were closing into a fist. Wolseley drew up the march like a train schedule. Scouts and special service officers went ahead. Engineers followed with axes, spades, timber, and rope. Behind them came long files of carriers under loads: ammunition, food supply, medical chests, gun parts. Then, in order, the infantry battalions and the field guns. Every night, a camp. Every morning, the same ritual of boots, straps, and checks. If the lifeline snapped, the army stopped. He first tried to hire 8,500 Fante carriers. On paper, it looked good. But in practice, the line cracked as these carriers deserted. And by the fourth day, much of the load train was failing. So he made a hard change. He turned to the 1st and 2nd West India Regiments, Caribbean soldiers with long service in the Empire, and converted significant parts of those units from fighters into carriers. It was not glorious work, but it saved the plan. An officer later wrote their effort had a most important influence on the future of the campaign. When it was over, Wolseley's farewell orders praised the West India regiments for doing a soldier's duty without complaint. Still, the men knew what had happened. They had carried so that others could fire. That mix of pride and slight walks through the whole story. Wolseley also cared about how the story looked at home. He brought trusted officers who understood the press and sent clear dispatches to keep the public on his side. But under the headlines were the same old basics: bridges, rations, and shoes that make or break a march. By late January 1874, the track reached the Pra. Pontoons creaked into place. The first companies crossed in dry season light. On the far bank, scouts found villages swept clean and paths cut and twisted, the forest whispering that the Ashanti were close. The columns stretched and bunched, their speed determined by how quickly the engineers could clear and how steadily the carriers could lift. The first big clash came at Amoaful on the 31st of January 1874. The Ashanti struck the advance guard from close cover. Another body slipped around and fired into the rear. For a long hour, the column fought two ways at once, front and back, in a tight green tunnel where a man could not see 20 yards. The British brought up rockets whose scream rattled nerves as much as they wounded, then bolted together the little screw guns and punched canisters into the brush where horns and war cries rose. Many officers and men went down. In the worst of it, African stretcher-bearers stepped into fire, lifted the wounded, and carried them to a hut hospital run by Dr. Henry Began, a naval surgeon from HMS Active, who turned a clearing into a theater. By evening, the British still held their ground. The Ashanti commander Amankwatiya was mortally wounded. The march could go on. 2 days later, the column reached the river Orda. Engineers laid a floating bridge that shifted under boot heels. The Rifle Brigade crossed and seized Ordaso on the 4th of February 1874. King Atta brought in thousands of Allied fighters to help hold the place. The baggage and the field hospital moved forward into the village. The Ashanti struck from every side, aiming to cut the expedition from its food and ammunition and to tear out its medical heart. For a time, the fight ran through lanes and between houses. If the village had fallen, the whole advance might have died there. It held. The line moved again. Kumasi lay ahead. The army entered Kumasi on the 4th of February 1874. As the British came close in the first week of February, the city seemed empty. The royal court and many leaders had withdrawn into the deeper forest. They hid sacred things they could not afford to lose. Kumasi was not a city of stone, but it boasted a spectacular architecture. It was a living place of timber, earth, shrines, and courts. Yet the king's palace showed something more. It spread across many courtyards with verandas and even a street front block in a Moorish style. Inside, British officers found rooms that felt like a curiosity shop. Books in several languages, letters and papers, European glass and furniture, fine craftwork, and royal regalia. This was a court that traded widely and kept its own library of knowledge. What happened next was a mix of war and plunder. Soldiers moved through those rooms and took treasures: gold ornaments, a state sword, badges worn by royal officials, pipes and stools, and other court pieces. Some items were kept as prizes, some were sold when the army returned, and many later sat in museum cases in Britain. Even today, parts of Ashanti regalia can be seen there, reminders of what left Kumasi in those days. Wolseley knew he could not garrison a faraway capital for long. The road behind him was too thin. Fever season was fast approaching. He chose a different kind of end. He and his troops set Kumasi on fire. Smoke rose over the forest. The act was meant to send a message to the Ashanti and to London. The British could reach the heart and hurt it. In Ashanti memory, the war was named for the man who ordered the burning. Sagrenti, their word for Wolseley. In British reports, it was called a clean stroke that would avoid years of patrols and deaths. In human terms, it was loss and shock that would echo for a long time. After fire came words. On the 9th of February 1874, the Asantewaa, Kofi Kakari, asked for peace. On the 13th of February, the two sides agreed on terms. On the 14th of March 1874, the Treaty of Fomena was formally signed. The language was blunt: 50,000 ounces of gold as indemnity. Renounce claims to Elmina and other coastlands. No more rent for forts. Withdraw Ashanti troops from the south. Keep the roads open for trade. Stop human sacrifice. British writers said little gold was paid, but the map changed at once. In 1874, the Gold Coast became a crown colony. The coast was now, clearly, British ground. The plan had worked because it answered the real enemies: rain, distance, delay. Dry season movement cut sickness. The road turned forest into a corridor. The river flotilla slid guns and messages inland. Rockets and portable artillery gave shock in tight bush. And when the hired carrier line failed, the West India Regiments shouldered the loads and kept the army breathing. In his last orders, Wolseley thanked them by name. Yet when the column reached Kumasi, those same men were not allowed to share the honor of entering the city. An officer named Caulfield wrote that the regiment which had borne the brunt for 8 months deserved better. That one detail shows the split in the Victorian army: deep respect when work was needed, thin respect when honors were handed out. Not every West Indian soldier carried. Some still fought and scouted. Late in 1873, Privates Robert Fagan and James Lewis of the 2nd West India Regiment crossed the Pra on a volunteer reconnaissance into Ashanti ground, risking torture and death if caught. They brought back the truth the army needed. A war reporter, G.A. Henty, called their mission one of the bravest feats of the whole campaign. In 1875, they received the Distinguished Conduct Medal, along with other West Indian soldiers who had shown the same quiet courage. Wolseley's reward was public. Parliament thanked him. Universities gave him honorary degrees. He was promoted and knighted. London even gave him a Sword of Honor. He kept rising until he became Commander-in-Chief of the army. People in Britain made a saying out of his name: "Everything's all Sir Garnet," meaning everything's in order. But in this story, order did not come from one man alone. It came from the system he built and the people who carried it. Engineers who cut and bridged. Sailors who forced the surf and the rivers. Stretcher-bearers who walked into bullets. A ship's doctor who turned a hut into a hospital. And Caribbean soldiers who carried a war so others could carry rifles. The Ashanti did not lose for lack of courage or skill. At Amoaful, they hit the column from 2 directions and nearly folded a British flank in thick cover. At Ordaso, they tried to rip out the army's heart at the baggage and hospital. They fought with nerve on the ground they knew. But they faced a method meant to blunt their strengths. A timed advance, a guarded lifeline, and a commander who refused to stay long enough for the forest and the climate to do their old work. The flames in Kumasi settled into ash. The treaty wrote a new coast. The Ashanti kept their core and their memory, strong enough to rise again in 1900, when a British official touched the golden stool and set off a new war. But this chapter, Sagrenti, belongs to the road, the dry months, and a planner who built his victory before the first shot at Amoaful. If this journey through Sagrenti moved you, stay with us. Hit subscribe, tap the bell, and share this film so more people can hear the story. Drop your thoughts and questions in the comments. What surprised you most, and which moments should we map on screen next? and join us next time as we return to Kumasi for one of the most famous and final encounters between the Ashanti and the British.